You're not a good person. The word justice is foul coming out of your mouth, reads an email that prosecutor Merritt Lingard receives mere days before she goes missing. In Netflix's new series, Department Q, this isn't just another angry message from someone she's put behind bars. It's an unsettling clue to why Merritt was taken and how no one is ever safe from one bad surprise ruining their entire life. While watching the show, I initially couldn't help but agree when Detective Carl Morck dismisses Merritt's case as hopeless. From a key witness who lost her eye only to be rejected by Merritt when she needed help most, to Merritt's brother whose inability to speak is connected to her ex-boyfriend, or one of the many burned by Merritt who, despite her success, was always described as trouble. She's gone and anyone could have done it. Except, Merritt isn't dead. She's been held captive for 4 years, writing the names of everyone she's ever put away, believing her captor's promise to release her if she'll just remember what she's done. Detective Q brings us along Merritt's years of captivity while simultaneously following the investigation that almost never happened. When Carl finally decides to take on Merritt's case, not out of hope, but because his new partner Akram refuses to give up, we witness a slow realization that the system designed to save Merritt is itself what allowed this to happen. Because in Department Q, solving the crime doesn't solve everything, but it does reveal who's been left to bleed. So before we move on, I think we really need to know, what is a cold case? There's really 2 answers for this. The truth is, the term cold case gets thrown around a lot. JonBenet Ramsey, the Zodiac Killer, the Chicago Tylenol murders, Tupac. But unfortunately, these are just some of the famous examples. Cases going cold is not uncommon. For a crime to be considered a cold case, all it needs is for leads to be just that, cold. Essentially, after a significant time has passed without any resolution, investigators will often be assigned to work on other cases. After all, there isn't anything left for them to look into, so the case will often be marked as inactive, pending further developments, or even closed altogether. It's difficult to pinpoint an exact number because cold cases exist in a kind of limbo, where they aren't even really referred to by that name until potential breakthroughs in technology, new testimonies, or evidence appear, and it is theoretically possible for them to be solved. To put this in perspective, roughly 50% of homicides and assaults go unsolved in the United States, and the percentages of other forms of unsolved crimes are staggering. What makes this even more frustrating is that many crimes have expiration dates, statutes of limitations that legally prevent persecution after a certain period of time has passed. While murder typically has no statute of limitations, other serious crimes like assault, fraud, or kidnapping often do. This means that even if new evidence emerges years later, justice might be legally impossible. What makes Department Q's approach unique is Carl and Akram's methodology for approaching these seemingly impossible cases. They look beyond old evidence at the victim's patterns and breaks in those patterns. What did Merritt do before she disappeared that was different than usual? What assumptions were made about how and when she disappeared? In Merritt's case, the pattern appeared clear. A successful prosecutor loses big case, disappears. But in the days before Merritt disappeared, she'd made attempts to apologize to the family of a girl she'd wronged. She'd gotten on a ferry to see the father she hadn't spoken to in years. These actions go against everything said about the stoic, couldn't care less about others' Merritt. It begins to paint the picture of someone taking steps to change her life, not someone planning to take it. Something that might be surprising is that not all cold cases are murders. Some may be bodies found that can't be identified either in the name of the victim or how they died. Less serious crimes like burglary, or even cases where a person has gone missing and there isn't any evidence of foul play, which is the status of Merritt's case when Department Q's Akram picks up her file. Merritt was a controversial character, to put it lightly. She was a child whose rural island life was turned upside down by the absence and eventual death of her mother, whose teenage years were marked by a rebellious attitude and an attack on her brother that left him unable to speak, and by some miracle of persistence and cutthroat ambition became a highly respected prosecutor. She's described by her colleagues as not being one of them, and is repeatedly referred to with colorful language that ranges from being a female dog to a see you next Tuesday. So here's where the second answer to what is a cold case forms. It forms in the spaces between the human/emotional definition and the bureaucratic one. Cases are only cold from an institutional perspective, never from the victim's lived experience. For them, the cold surrounding these cases is the loss of interest in pursuing justice on the victim's behalf. While investigators move on to fresh cases with better leads, the people left behind remain frozen in that moment when everything went wrong. For Merritt, no one had any reason to believe her disappearance wasn't the result of a high-strung workaholic depressed about losing a huge case. Case closed. But this isn't just about the victims, but those close to them. Take William, Merritt's brother, who runs back to the home he shared with his sister, now desolate, invaded by squatters, completely trashed. Everyone speaks of him with pity. Before his attack, he was so sweet, so smart, so much promise. But it was the apparently trouble Merritt who never abandoned him. William, too, never stopped waiting for his sister, never stopped drawing, never stopped hoping someone would find her. Because of the way Department Q is written, hopping between timelines, we don't know for sure when her captivity is taking place. It could have been right after a kidnapping, a year, 2 years. It isn't until her captors see the press conference announcing the reopening of her case that we realize she survived in a hyperbaric chamber for 4 years. This detail is more than a plot device. The hyperbaric chamber becomes a metaphor for how the system treats victims. She's kept alive, technically sustained, but never truly living. Just like how bureaucracy keeps victim stories technically active while ensuring they never get the resources needed to actually breathe freely. While William was drawing and trapped in a care facility that exploited his finances, Merritt was writing the names of everyone she'd ever prosecuted on her cell walls, forced to recite her crimes against them. Both siblings were trapped in their own versions of hell, waiting for someone to care enough to look. And that's what makes Department Q's approach so refreshing. It's a cold case about someone who is still alive and waiting to be rescued. For 4 years, while the case file gathered dust, Merritt was being held captive. If they had never reopened her case, she might have been killed or lived out her confined life for decades at the mercy of her captors. But that's the uncomfortable truth that the show forces us to confront. There's strong investment in cold case departments not because they're necessarily socially valuable or morally important, but because they look good. As the show cynically notes about the new cold case unit with its substantial budget, can't wait for the podcast. Speaking of which, I really hope Netflix doesn't cancel this show like they do so many others, because Department Q deserves the chance to explore that deeper threat of corruption I mentioned. Because investigations can be little more than performative justice, and as we'll see, police often care more about how the public perceives their work ethic than the impact their work actually makes. Throughout Department Q, I noticed various instances of how the justice system isn't merely flawed, it's broken. Take Mora's decision to use Department Q's funds to update the whole office while banishing Carl, Akram, and Rose to the stinky booty hole of the basement that used to be communal bathrooms and showers. Before their arrival, it was used to store broken, useless, or rarely used items, the perfect office space for a department that specializes in cases long forgotten or otherwise tossed aside due to a lack of evidence and/or little public interest. Thankfully, what makes Department Q work isn't the workspace. It's how the members, each infuriating and endearing in their own ways, play off each other. Thankfully, Moira proves to be a much better person than this suggests. If it weren't for her integrity and belief in Carl, Department Q would never have solved Mare's disappearance. However, her misuse of funds is the side effect of a much bigger issue. Governments and police often care more about the public image than the well-being of the community. This phenomenon, known in psychology as impression management, prioritizes how others perceive an organization over its actual effectiveness. Nestle, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, IKEA, tell me, what do these companies have in common? If you were to say they're all multinational corporations known for their widespread global presence and influence, you would be right. If you were to say they all engage in the concept of greenwashing, you would unfortunately also be right. Greenwashing is the deceitful practice where companies spend far more on marketing that talks about how much they help the environment than how much they actually spend on helping the environment. For example, Nestle pledged to make its packaging recyclable or reusable by 2025, but offered no clear plan, drawing condemnation from Greenpeace and being named a top plastic polluter. Coca-Cola, also named a world-leading plastic polluter, refused to abandon plastic bottles despite backlash, while continuing to promote its recycling goals. Starbucks introduced a strawless lid that ironically used more plastic, passing responsibility onto consumers and developing countries. Even IKEA, typically seen as a sustainability leader, was linked to illegal logging and criticized for demolishing a previously eco store to build a more sustainable one. All of these companies realized the possible monetary gain from making the consumer believe they were improving the world, but were unwilling to sacrifice their bottom line to make meaningful change. Police departments engage in their own version of this deceptive practice. Let's call it justice washing. Just like corporations prioritize their environmental image over actual environmental impact, police departments may care more about their public image than meaningful reform or community protection. They establish teams that the public thinks positively of, like cold case units, only throwing money at them when it seems like a good investment to improve their image. After all, how are organizations like the police really that different from corporations? In the US, police are funded by federal, state, and local governments through taxes levied on the population. The only difference is that while corporations are meant to give us momentary satisfaction through products, police are meant to protect us in our most vulnerable moments. When impression management becomes more important than actual protection, the consequences aren't just disappointing, they're deadly. That's exactly what we see in Department Q's creation. Higher-ups were displeased with their solve rate and wanted a big bang to bring back public approval. Doesn't the solving of every case serve the public interest? Moira asks about this, but like those corporate sustaining pledges, this goes in the wrong direction entirely. The real question is, are we solving cases to serve justice or to serve perception? Another example of this is the constable from Merritt's hometown, who always suspected Merritt's disappearance was connected to the younger brother of Merritt's teenage boyfriend. After all, he'd always believed the true culprit behind Merritt's brother's attack was the younger brother, not the elder, who the constable had chased to his death aboard the very same ferry where Merritt would disappear over a decade later. When Carl and Akram come knocking, he hides this knowledge, preferring to let the past die with Merritt, rather than disturb his town's sleepy, haven-like reputation. When protecting the system's image becomes more important than protecting people, everyone becomes expendable, because the system doesn't just fail those like Merritt, it fails the very people working within it and those who try to help them get justice for the victims who are unable to speak. For this, we should talk about Stephen Burns, Merritt's mentor, who's undoubtedly to blame for her loss in the biggest case of her career, and partially her image of a detached workaholic that led Merritt's case to be dismissed for years. I'll just be honest, Burns from the first time I saw him seemed sus. Which I was right, but his role in the mystery is less Moriarty mastermind than being an off-putting elitist and another victim of a crime. It's a bit complex, but there are essentially 3 crimes presented in Department Q. Merritt's disappearance, the case Merritt lost before she disappeared, and Carl's shooting. The circumstances of these crimes are only tangentially connected. Carl's shooting is the first we see. We're not left much in the way of an explanation other than it was likely staged to take out a policeman, likely related to the man who owns everything and everyone in the neighborhood where the crime took place. However, it does seem to be connected to a deeper threat of corruption that could be explored if it's picked up for more seasons. As is the running theme with this video essay, internal corruption is to blame not only for Merritt's 4-year captivity, but for the failed trial which justified closing Merritt's case as it seemed cut and dry that she made herself disappear. This trial, the last case Merritt covers before she's taken, is that of the death of Graham Finch's wife. All the evidence leads in the prosecution's favor. The wife's injuries match up with someone who was pushed rather than fell down the stairs. Finch's alibi was insubstantial. He's known to be physical, and his business is associated with seedy activities. But Finch also gives a marvelous performance as a man torn apart and left lost by his wife's death. It also doesn't help that while the evidence stacks against Finch, there is little to deny that it is circumstantial. This brings me back to Burns and the witness who could have swayed the jury in Merritt's favor, Kirsty. An inmate herself, Kirsty was put behind bars for her drug usage. But before her arrest, Kirsty was in a woman's refuge with a woman who was terrified of her husband retaliating by taking her life. It just so happens this woman was the wife of Graham Finch. By the time she meets Merritt, Kirsty's been clean 8 months, but there's still some speculation over her credibility. Burns convinced Merritt not to bring Kirsty into the courtroom, using this as his very argument. Unfortunately, even without testifying, Kirsty becomes the target of Finch's people on the inside. This results in her survival, but at the cost of her eye. Merritt is shaken by this event. She only ever did the minimum to help Kirsty, and even turned her back when Kirsty called, fearing for her life. It pushes Merritt, despite her better judgment, toward the reporter Sam Hague in his investigation into something rotten within her department. And as we know, Sam is not really Sam. He's Lyle, the younger brother of Merritt's deceased teenage boyfriend, the very same person who kidnaps and detains her under the pretense that all she need do is remember why. This stolen identity is another failure within the system. It's the reason the real Sam Hague, who managed to turn his troubled childhood around, was murdered, the reason Lyle and his history of violent, erratic behavior faded into history, the reason the abuse Lyle and his brothers suffered at the hands of their parents somehow didn't stop authorities from returning the kids when there wasn't anywhere else for them to go. These failures are how the system turns those meant to protect into instruments of harm. Burns didn't just make a poor judgment about Kirsty's credibility, he actively was working to ensure Merritt would lose her case. So why did Burns convince Merritt not to use Kirsty? It's mentioned that Finch hired someone to drive Burns' daughter off the road, which she did, flipping her car and paralyzing a pedestrian in the process. There's something deeper to this though. Burns is a servant of the law, yet even he had little faith in it protecting him or his family. Because as we so often see, the law is powerless to help people until a real crime has been committed. Worse still, the law fails victims when there isn't concrete evidence. The danger witnesses and victims put themselves in order to help sometimes doesn't feel worth it. They feel the perpetrator won't be put away, as so often they aren't, or not for long, and the victim will be left to deal with being terrorized, exploited, or ended. We see this in Department Q through Kirsty, but also Fergus, the original detective on Merritt's case. In Fergus's case, Carl initially believes Moira was pressured by someone to take him off the case, and/or that the investigation was intentionally botched. He confronts Moira, but her answer proves she needed Fergus on other cases, and when the pressure came, it only seemed natural to give in. She indeed kept a TV for herself from Department Q's huge budget, but they desperately needed the upgrade, and Carl was the only person she trusted who not only prefers to work on his own, but whose persistence would be the strongest tool put toward Department Q's success, not a fancy TV or computer. When Carl meets Fergus, the detective-turned-youth counselor, he insists at length on the actions he took to find Merritt. Carl believes him, and if there's any doubt left, it disappears when Fergus comes to warn Carl that someone has tried to silence him and prevent Fergus from helping Department Q. Yet despite all these systematic failures, Department Q shows us something incredibly important. People find ways to keep fighting. William never stopped trying to communicate even when no one put in the effort to listen. Carl keeps investigating even when threatened. Akram and Rose aid him at every turn despite dealing with their own issues, and Hardy gets back to his job, though how he does it has drastically changed. And ultimately, Merritt is found alive because someone decided her case was worth reopening even 4 years later. But Department Q isn't the tidy resolution that crime media usually sells us. Burns doesn't get exposed or redeemed for betraying Merritt, Kirsty still lost her eye, Hardy isn't going to miraculously walk. The system that failed them all is still broken. Department Q doesn't package these traumas into neat stories where justice always wins and closure always comes. Personally, I'm not even sure closure exists. I've always felt we learn to carry trauma differently, and that shutting it out or letting go of it is ignoring a foundational aspect of where we've come from and why we are who we are. And maybe that's exactly why we're so drawn to shows and movies about cold cases in the first place, because they promise something that feels impossible to achieve. So why are we so obsessed with shows about crime? You, Ozark, Peaky Blinders, Sherlock, Bones, CSI, True Detective, I could go on and on. For me, it's a game. Can I catch the criminal? Or if I were the criminal, how could I get away with it? It allows us to play out our what-ifs, to see if we could survive when the original victim could not, or when the original detective failed. We like playing detective and seeing if we can catch the kidnapper before Carl. This fascination taps into several psychological phenomena. The first is the just world theory, our deep-seated belief that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Crime shows temporarily shatter this illusion, then rebuild it when justice is served. We need to believe that the world makes sense, that there's order beneath the chaos. And this obsession isn't limited to fictional crime shows. True crime podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube channels have exploded in popularity, but there's a crucial difference. When we consume real crime stories, we're often watching someone else's actual trauma being packaged for our entertainment. Fictional crime like Department Q lets us explore these same psychological needs, the puzzle solving, the justice seeking, the vicarious trauma, without exploiting real victims. As for the vicarious trauma I mentioned, it is hard at work here. We can't distance ourselves from the victim, yet we are safely behind a screen. Humans are naturally curious about other human beings, and the human brain loves novelty. We might not get interested in someone having a heart attack, but someone getting killed or disappearing tugs on our inclination toward the strange and unusual. After all, how many of us worked out that Lyle and his mother were the kidnappers long before Merritt even guessed her captivity might have something to do with a teenage boy who she thought loved her, and yet stole from her family and beat the ability to communicate out of her brother? Like this aspect of Merritt's history, real life is really messy. So sometimes shows like Department Q can be calming. But why cold cases specifically? Cold case content has exploded across every platform, from online communities as early as 1999 to TikTok creators who prioritize getting these stories out there and finding justice for victims who can't do it for themselves. Perhaps this is a form of proxy where we get justice for those what-ifs, where it could have been us or our loved ones. We all had that event in our lives where we felt wronged. Likely an event where no one seemed to care about getting justice for us, and we were expected to suck it up and move on. But what if there had been someone to advocate for you? Or someone to come to you even years after this event and validate the harm that you suffered? Cold cases promise something that feels impossible to achieve in our own lives. That someone will care enough to keep looking. That time doesn't erase the importance of what happened to us. That justice delayed isn't always justice denied. This brings us to perhaps the most important distinction Department Q makes. Guilt is a state of being. Redemption is a state of action. This is strongly presented within Carl, Fergus, Merritt, Hardy, Rose, and Akram. By the end, all of them feel fulfilled by Merritt's rescue, but redemption is an ongoing battle. In Akram's case, we're not told enough about his situation, yet we can feel the responsibility he has for making sure victims aren't left behind. This is likely to do with his wife, a doctor whom he said died because she operated on the wrong person. Fergus continues to fight his alcoholism to work with kids who need it. Rose starts driving again after an accident caused the death of bystanders. Hardy is finally up and moving through his depression rather than letting it take his life. For Carl and Merritt, the solving of her disappearance is a turning point, especially for them. Merritt must now know her ex-boyfriend's actions were stupid, but one done to help her and him escape their families, and that a single event can drastically alter one's entire life. She will surely carry this forward and go after Finch for all of the single events he's responsible for that have ruined the lives of numerous nameless victims. Carl's own shooting is yet a mystery, but his successful salvaging of his relationship with his stepson, talks with his therapist, and the solving of Merritt's case undoubtedly gives him hope and drive that the shooting won't go unsolved. After all, if it becomes a cold case, who is left to investigate but Department Q? In a broken system that fails victims and those who try to help them, maybe the act of refusing to give up is the only justice we can guarantee. For all of us still waiting for someone to advocate for our own resolved hurts, Department Q offers something more valuable than closure. The reminder that trauma isn't something we shut out or let go of, but something we can transform into compassion for others who suffer in silence. If you enjoyed this emotional dive into Department Q's story, check out my other videos where I focus on how stories make us feel rather than how they're made. And when you're questioning why certain stories stick with you long after they end, ditto. That's why I'm Pickle Ditto, because whatever pickle you're in, I've probably been there too.